Verena, good to see you too.
Hey, I think it's 11:01, so I think it's about time. Yeah, we should get started. So this is the last seminar of the semester of VD, and we are very happy to have Garrett Johnson from Boston University, the marketing department, to give a talk on privacy enhanced methods. And so yeah, take it away. Thank you.
Thanks, Tommy, and appreciate you organizing this virtual seminar. It's great to see it continue, and it's a great honor to be asked to participate. So today I'm going to talk about new ways of advertising that use privacy-enhancing technologies to better balance the trade-offs between privacy and the data economy. And this is joint work with Shunto Kobayashi, who recently joined us from Caltech. So he's in his first year here, and Zhengrong Gu, who's my PhD student, and who will be on the market, I think, a year from now. All right, so this paper, let's start with a quick overview. There's two research questions we're going to go after. The first is, how effective are retargeted ads? So retargeted ads are the ads that follow you around the internet, trying to convince you to complete a purchase that maybe you started to initiate. And then the second question is, can privacy-enhanced retargeting be performant? Can it work? So in order to study this, we're going to use an experiment that I'm really excited about. It's a global, industry-wide open experiment to measure Privacy Sandbox's performance on 2% of Chrome users. And the data we're going to use here is from over 2,000 advertisers in the first half of 2024 from an ad tech provider, which is a demand-side platform. And the high-level results is we're going to show that retargeting causes a 4.6% lift in conversions on an intent-to-treat basis, and that privacy-enhanced retargeting retains 80% of or more of the ad performance on a per spend or per impression adjusted basis. So I want to start with a very high-level motivation, thinking about online advertising and the advantages and disadvantages of them. So if you talk to most economists, they probably just say, what differentiates online advertising is targeting. And I would say if you go deeper, what differentiates online advertising is the ability to know who a user is across websites or across apps using identifiers like third-party cookies, combined with the ability to purchase ads at the impression level in an automated fashion. Now, if you put these two things together, you get three very powerful sources of value for firms. Number one, you can target. So you can target people based on their interests inferred from their browsing. And certainly a classic case of that is retargeting. The second is you can measure ad effectiveness by linking ad user views to conversions on the advertiser's websites. And number three, you can put these two things together to optimize the ad campaigns. That is to say that you can better match users to ads. So all this has transformed online advertising, but advertising and online advertising in particular has disadvantages and critics. So here's kind of two books by some of the most significant critics and most significant criticisms of online advertising. The first criticism is that basically the stuff doesn't work. And as soon as advertisers figure out that advertising doesn't work, the whole industry is going to collapse like a stack of cards, or house of cards. And if we yes, Javier, I think you need to unmute. Unless you have a question, of course, feel free to interrupt. So if we take kind of the Steelman version of this, we would say there's a lot of endogeneity problems in trying to measure the effectiveness of advertising. There's agency problems both within and across firms where no one wants to say that the ads don't work. And even under ideal circumstances with clean experiments, you still have a statistical power problem. And so I think if you look at what economists have to say about advertising maybe 20 or 30 years ago, they would say, firms behave optimally, therefore they advertise optimally. There's nothing to see here. But we've seen with the eBay search paper and Brad Shapiro and co-authors paper looking at TV advertising that it can be the case that firms are actually advertising and the ROI appears negative. And so there is some empirical basis to be skeptical of this. And we're going to ask this question about retargeted digital advertising because we think that the endogeneity problems are especially acute there, right? You're showing ads to people that look like they are already going to buy. Then the second main criticism is this criticism about the loss of privacy. And like Shoshana Zuboff would say that this is just surveillance capitalism. So we're going to tackle this in a very different way. We're going to look at a technological solution to this. So Privacy Sandbox, which is Google's approach to using privacy-enhancing technologies to advertising, is trying to solve this problem by allowing us to have economic uses of data while still creating privacy protections for users. And then the big research question we're going to answer there is, can this stuff actually work? And we're again focused on retargeted ads, so can this actually work in the retargeting setting? Okay, so our agenda for today, a lot of things, but try to move quickly. So talk about the literature, explain what this mysterious privacy sandbox stuff is, talk about the experimental design, which I think is quite unusual and exciting, discuss our data, our estimation methodology, and spend quite a bit of time on results. I would like to take the time to show you the impact on publisher revenue as well, because I think that would just take 5 or 8 minutes. So that I think complements well this paper. And then we'll conclude. And feel free to interrupt if you have questions. Happy to save time at the end, but happy to stop as we go as well. Okay, so we see ourselves contributing to two main literatures here. So the first is the literature on privacy in marketing and economics. On the topic of Privacy Sandbox, several authors have looked at various aspects of this. Our paper and the publisher paper that's kind of the companion paper here are the two projects that examine this large-scale experiment to see how well this performs. So the best comparable there is actually data that's coming from industry that are also leveraging this experiment. But the broader literature, looks at structural approaches to measure the effectiveness of Privacy Sandbox, asks how firms can make use of the noised measurement data that they get. And this paper here, this Giraffe and Miller paper, looks at how consumers react to this form of advertising. And then on the advertising effectiveness side, we see ourselves contributing to the literatures that look at many advertiser experiments. And then, one potential criticism of that literature is that you're conditioning on firms that are running experiments, and so they may be selected in ways that differ from the general population. And there are a few papers that try to do this, without selection, and we see ourselves adding to that. And then finally, there is a literature on the effectiveness of retargeting, including a paper that I've written and Navdeep Stani at Stanford has written. But these are just case studies, and so we want to be able to look at more generalizable insights across thousands of firms. All right, so let's talk about this Privacy Sandbox. So the big idea of Privacy Sandbox is to use multiple technologies in order to preserve the benefits of cross-site and cross-app identity in online advertising, which are the benefits I started the talk out with, while offering superior privacy protection to users. So, we want to try to have our cake and eat it too here. Before I unpack a little bit of what these technologies are, let me give you a quick timeline of this. So in 2019, Google launched this initiative saying that they're going to get rid of third-party cookies and build Privacy Sandbox as replacement technologies. They made these technologies generally available in Chrome, so most all users on Chrome have these APIs available now. And then in January 2024, Google turned off cookies for 1% of its user base, which is significant. This is like 30 million users globally. This was part of a joint experiment between Google and the regulator that's overseeing them, which is the UK's Competition and Markets Authority. just full disclosure, I actually was the outside expert for this, for the CMA on this project, specifically related to analyzing this experiment. So, the usual disclaimer applies there. And then in midway through last year, Google said, JK, we're not going to get rid of third-party cookies. We're going to ask users whether they want to keep third-party cookies or block third-party cookies. And the expectation is that most users would say that they would block third-party cookies. And so Google would sort of pivot the blame from it being the company that gets rid of third-party cookies to the users doing it on their behalf. And then a couple of weeks ago, Google changed its plan yet again. They abandoned third-party cookie deprecation. They said, users could always go into their settings and block third-party cookies. There's no need for us to force a choice for them. And this, is met with, I guess, a lot of mixed emotions from industry, but certainly a fair amount of disappointment after, or not disappointment, I guess, but frustration, I suppose, would be a good word, because, for 6 years, they were saying that the cookie deprecation is right around the bend, and they changed that plan. But what's interesting is that they're not getting rid of third-party cookies. They're not getting rid of Privacy Sandbox. They're going to continue investing in that, and there's other firms that also said that they're going to keep investing in these technologies. Okay, so what are these technologies? Now, fundamentally, third-party cookies are a very elegant silver bullet solution to many use cases that advertisers care about. And if you get rid of third-party cookies or these cross-site identifiers altogether, cross-app identifiers altogether, no one's found another silver bullet that does everything. And so the approach has been to develop separate technologies for separate use cases. And so on the targeting side, there's Topics API, which is all about giving very broad categories for users. Like, there's some people that are interested in tennis, and there's some that are interested in hockey. The second is the Protected Audience API, which I'll talk about on the next slide, because it's quite a bit more aggressive. Then on the measurement side, there's the Attribution Reporting API, which has many features, which includes adding differential privacy noise to the signals that advertisers get back in order to preserve consumer privacy. The third is anti-fraud. And then the last is just there's changes that Chrome is making to the browser to make it harder for advertisers and other companies to track users. So as I said, I want to talk a bit more about Protected Audience API, because that's the focus of today's talk. So the traditional way that retargeting works is that it uses cookies to track users across websites and identify those users. And so the criticism that the industry receives is that when a user arrives on a web page, their cookie identifier, which is synonymous but is considered personal data under the GDPR, gets broadcast to dozens, potentially over 100 firms that are bidding on that user, and potentially storing on some external server somewheres, a log that says, Tommy went to these websites, or some synonymous identifier associated with Tommy went to these websites on these days, which might make Tommy a bit nervous, or make any of us a bit nervous. And so what Protected Audience does is very aggressive. They say, instead of the data leaving the device and spewing to the industry, we're going to make the entire industry come to the user's device and keep the personal data on the user's device. So the way this works is that you'll go to a website like Macy's, and if Macy's wants to show ads to you, they're going to tell the browser that they want you to join what's called an interest group. An interest group just stores a URL for the creative that they want to show you, as well as their bidding preferences for showing you ads off-site. Critically, this data never leaves the browser. And then in the second part, when you go to a website that wants to show you a targeted ad, like the Washington Post will tell your browser that they want it to host a protected audience auction that's going to look at all of the interest groups that you belong to and run the auction rules specified by the Washington Post. and some advertiser is going to win that ad. And so let's say Macy's wins that ad. Now, if we take a step back here, this is really quite remarkable. Retargeting is one of the more salient cases of connecting, users' behavior across websites. But with this technology, it's possible for Macy's to show you an ad on the Washington Post without Macy's knowing that you've been to the Washington Post, or the Washington Post knowing that you've been to Macy's, or for that matter, any other ad tech company. So in the back of our minds, it's important to keep a sense of how much these technologies are being used. So I have another paper that tracks the adoption of these technologies across 60,000 top commercial websites. To do this, I partnered with a startup that specializes in visiting data and collecting their metadata. And so on that basis, I know that in the first half of 2024, about 13 to 18% of websites were running these protected audience auctions, and that roughly 7 to 22% of sites were adding users to protected audience interest groups. If you're interested in learning more about the other technologies, the vendors that are using this, the market share, the trends over time, I make this all public in a dashboard at this website. And I guess I could just put it in the chat here for fun too, because boom, that was easy. Okay. Any questions before I move to the experimental design? Seeing none, let's push forward a bit more. Okay, so this is a really ambitious experiment that runs throughout the industry in order to evaluate Privacy Sandbox for the regulator as well as for industry. And in this experiment, the backbone of the experiment is randomizing eligible Chrome users into 3 main groups. Now, the quick, what determines whether you're eligible as a Chrome user is basically, do you allow third-party cookies as opposed to digging into your settings and blocking that? And do you have a recent enough version of Chrome where you have the Privacy Sandbox technologies? So not super restrictive. So these 3 groups are, number 1, the status quo group. The status quo group has third-party cookies turned on, Privacy Sandbox turned off. That's 1% of Chrome users, or about 30 million people. And then the second group is the Privacy Sandbox group that has third-party cookies turned off and Privacy Sandbox turned on, and that's 0.75% of users. And then cookieless users are users that have neither technology activated, and they're 0.25% of users. And so, one kind of interesting feature about this experiment is that there's 2 baselines. There's the status quo baseline, and there's the get rid of cookies without replacement technologies baseline. And then a part of what we're going to look at is basically between these 2 yardsticks, how much progress is Privacy Sandbox making? I do see a couple questions, so let me just read them aloud. Wondering how much users care. What is user rate for ad blocker with cookie blocks or say incognito mode in browsers? Well, I mean, that's a $1 million, I guess $1 million question here is how much do users care about this? So ad blocker rates in North America, off the top of my head, they're like 20-25%. I think many of the traditional ad blockers don't actually block third-party cookies. So they're sort of, providing, if you're a privacy purist, maybe not enough privacy protection. Incognito mode. So actually to be eligible, you can't be in incognito mode because in incognito mode, Chrome blocks third-party cookies by default. And I do not know exactly what share of incognito mode is. My total guesstimate would be maybe 10%, but I'm not sure. But yes, I guess the fundamental question is how much do users care? I guess the public discussion would suggest that they care a lot, and maybe measures of adoption of cookie blocking technologies and changes of browser share maybe suggested that it's not the most important thing for consumers. There's very long been Chrome and Safari blocking third-party cookies. Their browser shares have not, dramatically increased at the expense of Chrome. But pressure comes from many places. It comes from the public discussion, and it also comes from regulation. And certainly there's differences geographically. And so there's much more pressure on cookies in Europe, for instance. Okay. Can third-party cookies and Privacy Sandbox be turned on at the same time? Yes. So essentially this is 2% of users, the 98% of users, Privacy Sandbox is turned on as long as when the prompt came up, you didn't say, get this out of my face. But that was more for Topics API. I think they sort of opt you in by default to Poppy and to the attribution reporting API. And then third-party cookies, that's also on by default for most users on Chrome. Some people choose to block it, and some people choose to block it on a site-by-site basis when the site asks for their permission to use cookies. So definitely, there's a large part of the market in principle that can use Privacy Sandbox. Though in practice, some of these vendors may choose to specialize on this, 0.75% of users. Okay, thanks for great questions. So I want to talk a little bit about this experiment and what I find really exciting about this experiment. Plenty of limitations. We could spend the whole hour on that. So in terms of positives, so one thing that this is doing that I think is kind of unique is that it's doing ex ante policy evaluation. And it's in cooperation between two regulators, a competition regulator and a privacy regulator, which are de facto, the UK is basically the de facto leading global regulator here. And they're collaborating with industry and Google in particular to make this experiment work. I think another unique feature of this is that these technologies are kind of a weird form of innovation in that we expect probably commercially worse outcomes from using these technologies, but this should be improving user privacy. And so I think a difficult question for regulators is just how much are you willing to trade one for another? The second thing that I think is really unique and interesting about this experiment, because there's gazillions of online experiments, is that this is an open experiment, and that anyone can participate and analyze the data from this experiment, so long as they can query the browser to be able to obtain these 3 different user labels. And so we're able to piggyback on that to analyze the experiment. The scale, of course, is very large. It's global. 2% of Chrome users is about 60 million users. It's a field experiment, so we get to see real-world activity. That's not always perfect. In the wild of the open internet, we have weird things like bot activity. In terms of compliance, on the user side, compliance is very high because it's enforced at the browser level and varied experimentally. Kind of going back to Sherry's question, it is possible to, for instance, if you're in the cookie group, to turn on cookies for an individual website. But we expect that users' actions are probably not happening a lot in that way. And then on the industry side, that's where compliance is really binding. It's really there's voluntary compliance, and not everyone's going to use these technologies. The good news is that we don't just see a partial equilibrium result from a single firm making a change. Bad news is that we don't see the long-run general equilibrium. That's what, to inform the policy evaluation question, that's exactly what we want to know, but we don't get to see, full adoption of these technologies in 2024. And because industry compliance is voluntary, our results are basically going to depend on how many firms are compliant. So if nobody uses these things, the effect of this is going to be 0. And if everyone uses it, we get to see the full ceiling. And finally, this is unusual in that it's not like a single treatment of one technology. There's many fundamental ad technologies that are changing in the Privacy Sandbox group. I think arguably a strength of our paper is that we're focusing on the protected audience API, And so maybe we get cleaner results from that sense. Okay, so let's focus in on zoom in on what this experiment means for our particular data case. So if we think about what happens in retargeting, retargeting is you visit the web page and then you browse a product and show some interest in purchasing that product. And then when you go to another website like the Washington Post, Macy's can show you an ad. And then at the end of that journey, you choose to buy or not buy. So I encourage people to actually just speak up, but I see another question in the chat. So Brian is asking, why is the publisher needed? WP in your slide. If the users indicate they want ads from select brands, the ad platform could just have a page the users could go to see current ads of interest. Well, I think in principle, I see what you're getting at. In practice, I guess the social good of advertising is it's helping to pay for publishers, and on a practical mode, people don't especially seek out advertising and don't seek to update their interests. And so having this happen in the background in a low friction way is kind of the magic that makes the internet go round on a free basis. So yeah. So yeah, I think practically the publishers are providing the bundled eyeballs that advertisers need to pay for and be able to capture some of users' attention. Okay, so this is kind of the broad overview. Let's talk about how this works with our experiment. So in the status quo group, it's going to look much like the previous slide. We've got our cookie monster here. The user goes to Macy's. They've got a cookie on their computer. They then visit, in this case, multiple websites. On those websites, there's an ad auction that's run to determine, who sees what ads. And as an outcome to that, this user is going to see potentially multiple ads. And at the end, they're going to either convert or not convert. Now, the sandbox group has a very similar story. Instead of cookies, the Macy's is going to use an interest group. The user is going to continue to visit 3 different websites. Now, what's different here is that, as I referred to a few slides back, not all websites are participating in protected audience auctions. And so, there's still going to be an auction mechanism that's run. There's still going to be some ads that are shown to these users. But on average, we'd expect fewer ads to be shown to those users. And then at the end of the day, there's going to be still this decision to convert or not. And then last but not least, we've got the cookieless group, the deep cut for the Sesame Street fans in the room. This is Cookie Monster's cousin. And Cookie Monster's cousin is famous because she does not like cookies, which just breaks Cookie Monster's brain. So she's representing the cookieless group. And in the cookieless group, we don't have cookies and we don't have interest groups. And so there's not really a way for the advertiser to show you ads on these 3 different websites. And so but still at the end of that journey, you're going to make a decision to purchase or not. So this is kind of a nice overarching description of what we're doing in the paper. And you can see that this cookieless group is actually very useful for telling us the effectiveness of retargeted ads, because we're able to compare users here and here as well that are seeing retargeted ads to users in this group that don't, or at least should not be seeing retargeted ads. And so that tells us about the incremental effects of ads. This sandbox group, we expect the performance is probably going to lie between these 2 groups. And interpreting that difference in performance is going to be colored by the fact that user is, on average, going to be seeing fewer ads. So I see that Javier is asking, how does Google get paid under the privacy sandbox model? That's an interesting question. So the short answer that is sort of weird here is that these things cost money to participate in. These ones are sort of being outsourced to the browser, and at least, there's not been a fee associated with running these things. Potentially you're working with vendors that are keying into this that are charging you a fee, but this is being offered without a fee. I guess, one potential concern that you might have is that this centralizes a lot of power in the browser, and you might worry that maybe a fee gets charged in the future. One way that Google or another company can make money from this is if this device, this is sort of a longer story, but if the auction moves from your browser to a server, which is called a trusted server, which unlike this server doesn't write anything to disk, and so it can be faster, but is better for people's privacy. That's going to rack up some AWS bills or Google Cloud bills or whatever is your company of choice. So there is some additional expenditures that come from using these sorts of technologies that will accrue to whatever companies offer those services. But yeah, I think one interesting feature of this is that at least initially, you could see that maybe there's some cost advantages of these different technologies. Great question. Okay, so let's talk about data. Google is the ad platform that could cut out the publisher and increase revenue. I mean, Google can do many things, but publishers still have valuable real estate that rents attention, and that attention has been valued by advertisers. Google has, YouTube as its main source of kind of owned and operated attention. And so it can accrue some of the benefits here. Google obviously has a very large ad tech business. So large, in fact, that it was very recently found to be a monopolist in a case prosecuted by the Department of Justice. So, Google has a vested interest in having money flow to publishers as well. Okay, so the data that we're going to get is from a company that's a demand side platform, which is just a type of ad tech firm that works with advertisers. The data we're going to obtain is weekly total advertiser outcomes. So these outcomes are clicks and conversions. Conversions are, for most of our cases, a purchase, but in some percentage of the time, it's a lead to another website to potentially make a purchase. And if you don't know click-through conversions, it's just the set of conversions that are initiated with a click on one of these ads. And we see this aggregated by 3 experimental groups. So one thing to just be clear right from the get-go here, we only have aggregate outcomes. We do not have user-level data. And so our data is going to look a lot like Google Analytics style data, which is sometimes used in this literature. And the way we're able to get this is that the DSP has a direct integration with the advertiser's conversion tracking. So the advertisers shares that data back with the DSP because the DSP uses that to deliver, better prospects at lower cost to the advertiser. So our sample is going to grow from 1,400 advertisers from the end of January to over 2,000 at the end of our sample. The reason for that growth is that transitioning a campaign from a cookie-based campaign to a protected audience-based campaign takes some engineering, and so there's some additional entry as a result of that. One thing that's very important to keep in mind is that we don't have to worry about advertiser selection in the sense that we're only looking at advertiser weeks where they're advertising both in the third-party cookie world and in the protected audience world. And our demand side platform is defaulting its advertisers into doing both. So there's no kind of choice to do that beyond the engineering choice of which of these campaigns do we put into this system first. And then the last point here is just to say that even though we have 2% of users, we have millions of ad clicks and conversions and hundreds of millions of impressions. So there's really a lot of volume here. But of course, when you're dealing with groups as small as 0.25% of users, you do get also a lot of zeros in terms of activities associated with in aggregate with those users. Okay, so then moving to just some quick descriptives, our data tilts more towards advertisers from Europe. About 2/3 are from Europe, but there's every continent is represented here. And then in terms of industry verticals, we get a broad array of industries that are using retargeted ads with our provider. We see that fashion is by far the largest. So I guess, the anecdote of a pair of shoes following you around the internet is, I guess there's maybe some additional data signal behind that. Now there's one feature or bug of our experiment is that there's a certain amount of contamination that's happening. So if we look at the ad impressions in the status quo group versus the cookieless group, then we see that there's 93% fewer impressions in the cookieless group. Now you should be asking, why isn't that 100%? Because I told you that there isn't any cookies and there isn't any interest groups, so there should be no way to identify these users. And so what's happening here is what's called identity bridging. And so the way this works is that Chrome is deleting a bunch of cookies, but sellers are rebuilding the deleted IDs using other things they know about you, like your first-party cookie ID. So this ID bridging is debatably fraud because the seller is misrepresenting that you have an ID when it's been deleted. But some advertisers value the fact that you can still target users on this basis. So effectively, our partner DSP was duped into buying ads in the cookieless and privacy sandbox groups in its cookie-based bidding systems through this mechanism. And then the last thing I'll show you about the data is that, I've shown you the status quo in the cookieless group. In the sandbox group, the red is the protected audience API volume of data. And you see that there's just about half as many impressions that are flowing through protected audience API than the traditional cookie-based system. And we think that the obvious explanation for this is that many websites don't use protected audience API auctions, and so that puts a ceiling on the amount of inventory that you can purchase at comparable prices. Okay, so our estimation methodology, very simply, again, we have aggregate data by advertiser week, treatment group, and device. And we can't directly compare these groups to each other because they are different in size. But if we use Poisson regression with these offsets or weights given by these different shares, then the kind of residual differences between these groups is explained by the different technologies that are accessible for those users. And so that gives us our experimental estimates. Okay, so our results then. Before I show you the retargeting results, I want to remind us why we should care about this. So the first reason we should care is that this is a very popular targeting strategy. It's also a targeting strategy that's associated with high bids. And so this is very valuable to publishers. From an economist standpoint, we also worry about whether this stuff actually works because we worry about selection, and retargeting is targeting people that look like they're about to buy. So there's kind of an analogy here to the branded search case with Tom Blake. And we also may be concerned that by showing users these ads that are quite privacy invasive, we might be sufficiently irritating them that conversions actually go down. Now, if you look at what we know about this, industry studies, it's always sunny in industry land. So they're saying that these ads are very, very effective. The academic literature is more circumspect, finding smaller effect sizes, but they're positive, and albeit just case studies. So we find across our 2,000 advertisers, comparing the cookieless and status quo groups, that there's a 4.6% increase in conversions from showing people retargeted ads. And here's our confidence intervals around that. So you see that it's noisy, but statistically significant. Some caveats. Caveat number one, this is an intent to treat estimate. A advertiser or website isn't going to target all the users that visits its webpage. So at least on an absolute basis, the average treatment effect on the treated would be larger. The second caveat briefly is that because of this contamination, there's a little bit of advertising that's slipping through to these cookieless users. So a clean holdout experiment would give you a little larger estimate. And then finally, this estimate is in the ballpark of estimates that have come from Meta and from Google for large meta studies of advertising effectiveness that are more kind of lower funnel conversion outcomes. All right, so then the second question again is, can privacy enhancing advertising be performant? And before we look at that, it's worth asking ourselves, like, why would these things be different? So on the positive side, protected audience API is basically purpose-built for retargeting. And so because it should translate very well, we hopefully would expect not a lot of slippage. But there are several reasons why it could be worse. Number one, as we've talked about quite a bit, there's this limited supply of protected audience impressions. Number two, there's latency issues with how these ads take about twice as long to load because your devices aren't quite as powerful. There's certain privacy restrictions that are built into these things that could reduce effectiveness. It could be harder for advertisers to optimize this. There's certainly engineering and scaling issues for these newer technologies. On the more positive side, you could improve outcomes because you're not having to connect cookie IDs across websites, which creates latency and expense. And then, just recall that we're going to use we're going to evaluate how far Sandbox performs in between these two benchmarks, and we're going to call that the recovery share. So in the previous slide, I showed you conversion estimates. We're actually going to focus on ad clicks and click-through conversion outcomes for two reasons. Number one, click-through conversions are useful for predicting the incremental lift in conversion from other research by Brett Gordon and co-authors. And number two, welcome to online advertising. These estimates are extremely imprecise. So you can see the estimates relative to the status quo here and here. The recovery share is only 20% when you compare these two estimates, but the confidence interval around this is so wide you could park a few semi-trucks in there. So let's focus on clicks instead. On a clicks basis, we see that there's 47% fewer clicks in Privacy Sandbox relative to the status quo. In click-through conversions, we see a similar number, implying a recovery share of 44%. So, why aren't we getting all the way to 100%? Well, recall, I showed you previously that the number of impressions and the volume of ad spend was significantly lower in the Sandbox group because there's less supply. And so it's probably not fair to say that, these things perform half as well as the status quo because there's half as many impressions to buy. And so we're going to use our big econometrics brains and do something very complicated, which is we're going to divide the average here by the average here, because we think that's maybe a little bit of a fair comparison. And when we take the average of the sample outcomes, we see that on a per dollar basis and a per impression basis, the click performance and the click-through conversion performance is on the neighborhood of 80 to 93% as good. So from an advertiser perspective, this seems to be good news. If a regulator were to come down tomorrow and say we're getting rid of third-party cookies, you might have some be able to sleep a little bit better at night here. The other piece of good news is that we're comparing systems that have like a decade worth of engineering into them to systems that have months or maybe a year of engineering into them. And so there's maybe some capacity for that to improve. Okay, so we are at 11:45, and so I took some questions during the talk, but how about I just conclude and answer questions, and if people want to hear about the publisher results, I'll be happy to take as much or as little time to talk about those as well. So to wrap up, we've shown that retargeting seems to cause an incremental lift in conversions. It's about 5% on an intent to treat basis. We found that these privacy-enhanced ways of showing retargeted ads seem to perform not quite as well, but still 80% or more of the ad performance once you adjust for per spend and per impression. We certainly have this problem that there's soft market adoption of these technologies, and so that's going to put a ceiling on the amount of performance you can gain from them. For future research, I think a very interesting question, pardon me, is how do non-retargeted ad campaigns perform with Privacy Sandbox? And I ask that because obviously we're focusing on retargeting, number one, and number two, retargeting translates very nicely to protected audience API. Some of the other forms of targeting may translate, I guess, differently to Privacy Sandbox, and so you could expect some differences there. And finally, there's lots of challenges that we're coming across. We have interdependence in the experiment, contamination, the inability to extrapolate to the long-run general equilibrium, the difficulty of adjusting for experimental comparisons that have very different levels of market adoption and market conditions across these groups. We hope we've made reasonable decisions in adjusting for that. But yes, some of these challenges are quite fundamental. All right, so thank you so much for your attention and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Garrett. So we can take questions now, and you can raise your hand in Zoom and then unmute yourself if you want.
Not everybody all at once. Okay, I'm going to give a few more seconds and I'm going to show you the publisher results. If that's not a sufficient threat, looks like Brian's unmuted. Do you have a question, Brian?
Yeah, I'm just, the question about the viability of this. If Google is the one that's going to be, cutting out the publisher, and
That's going to be what, the publisher?
Potentially cutting out the publisher. I mean, they control the browser, so they could just put a page up and substitutes for the publisher's page, and show all the ads that the user expressed interest in, or from the brands that they expressed interest in. So it just seems like it's
I mean, I think the problem with that argument is that no one's going to visit that page, right? Like Google could put up a page that says, here's a bunch of ads, and no one will visit.
Wait a minute, though.
Right? They're
If
going
they
to
control the browser, they can have a little sidebar wherever they want it, or pop up and show ads they're interested. They don't even have to necessarily be ads. I mean, they could just be a page that automatically shows up. Because the user expressed interest. They expressed interest in the ads, and so therefore, you're giving them what they've requested for.
They haven't requested it. The advertiser requested it, and that's a distinction, right? So you haven't gone to Macy's and said, "Boy, I would love to see ads for Macy's." Macy's made that decision on your behalf, and there's competition issues, right?
Okay.
If Google starts to put a bunch of ads on your website, then on their browser, then consumers could just leave for another browser, number one. And number two, I mean, I think Google faces plenty of criticism about starving, rightly and wrongly, the open web from advertising revenue.
Well, wait a minute. Maybe I misunderstood, because I thought you were saying that the user had to give their preference after they saw the ad from the brand, Macy's in your example, that they wanted to, they were open to more from them, something to that effect.
No, it's all passive. So it's all happening in the background. You're visiting web pages. The web pages are making just choices about whether they want to show you ads on other websites. Um,
Well, yeah, I understand that, but how do you, when it comes to the retargeting, where do you say, yes, you can you can retarget me?
the
Where do they
same way
give
with cookies.
permission
You
to
don't
that?
say yes, it just happens.
Well, that's how it is now, but I thought this was a privacy thing where they had control over it. Is that not what, did I
I mean,
misunderstand that?
I think the privacy, and I think this is where um, there's some confusion and some meaty issues here, which is that like from a very instrumental perspective, a user sees a retargeted ad in the third-party cookie world, and will continue to see a retargeted ad in the privacy sandbox world. And so there's not like a big change there from the user's perspective. What's changed is that if we're really worried that, I went to what would be embarrassing to me as a Canadian. If I went to a Calgary Flames website and looked at a Calgary Flames jersey, which makes me want to vomit in my mouth, there's some record on a server that says that, some ID associated with Garrett Johnson is looking to buy a Calgary Flames jersey. That record disappears in a world with protected audiences. And so I think a big question for consumers and other papers, this paper with Klaus Miller looks at this question, how does that affect consumers' privacy valuations? And the answer in their paper is not a whole lot. But I think the other problem with that is that consumers don't fully, part of the issue with these new technologies is consumers are trying to get their heads around them too. So anyways, I think maybe Coleman had a question.
Yeah. Sorry if I was kind of in and out. So if this is like a inaccurate question, or you feel free to just move along. I was wondering about, like, it seems the big privacy, or sorry, one of the facets that would be important for privacy concerns is not just whether there are cookies, but the persistence of the cookies. So if there's a cookie that lasted an hour and then it got deleted, maybe I'd be less concerned about this. Is this something that can be looked at? Have people looked at this before? I know cookies do have different durations, but I don't know if this is sort of something that you can look at experimentally.
Yeah, a few thoughts there. So it's hard to look at that experimentally. Klaus Miller and Bernd Skiera have a paper where they observationally compare users with different cookie lengths. And the basic idea there is more history means that the cookies are more valuable. I'm not sure if they showed this in the paper, but I think my intuition is that there's kind of a logarithmic relationship there. There's just that the value of that decays over time because the more recent information is more valuable. You're saying something very reasonable. The challenging thing about that, though, is that if you were to put that into practice, then you would have this problem of ID bridging, where you have the cookies that last an hour, but I know something else about you that allows me to regenerate that cookie the next hour. And so in practice, that doesn't, fully solve the problem. Now, I mentioned this very briefly, but Protected Audience API had a 30-day limit on how long that these things could last. I think they increased that to 90 days. And I think that's part of the trade-off with advertisers is like, for the reason you expressed, maybe you want these things to be shorter lived. But some advertisers have campaigns that are basically reactivation campaigns where they say, I haven't seen Coleman in 2 months, and I want to try to catch him, get him to come back to me. And so I'm going to show him ads 2 months later. If the limit is an hour or 30 days, you obviously can't do that. I see a hand from Javier.
Hi, yes. I was wondering, this is basically pushing the ad platform into the browser itself, right?
Yep.
Okay.
And yeah, like I said, there's some issues with that, and there's another plan to not just have this being done on your device, but being outsourced to a server, much like it's being done in the status quo. But the difference is that server is what's called a trusted server, which has some protections around it, including the fact that it's not writing data to disk. so that you can, have more rapid private advertising without this danger that you have a bunch of records on servers saying, which websites you visited.
I have a question actually. So, so the not all the advertisers participate in the sandbox auction, right? And so is it like the efficiency of matching would be higher when there are more advertisers in the sandbox auction? So I see that in one of your slides that the number of advertisers actually increase over time in your sample period, right? Is that, I wonder if there's something that you can test in especially at the beginning, not a lot of advertisers to match the efficiency of the matching is lower, and then later on when there's a lot more advertisers participating, the efficiency would be high. I don't know whether there's something that you can actually see or test in your data.
Yeah, we can think a little bit about this. I think, I agree with your intuition here. I think, we have looked at like intertemporal differences, and it's just, I think, these problems I talked about here of just like, this experiment has many changes that are happening on at the same time. Yes, you may be adding more advertisers to these marketplaces, but your competitors might be as well. The supply curve may be moving at the same time because more websites are offering these auctions, and we do not have perfect data on either side to be able to triangulate that. So yeah, I mean, we see differences over time, but it's hard to know what is the source of those differences. But yeah, so I apologize. It's maybe not the most satisfying answer, but I think you're trying to ask a very interesting question.
Any more questions? We still have 2 minutes.
Maybe let me show you the publisher numbers in a slide. So we are able to work with the company that's the largest ad tech company serving publishers on a holistic basis so that we can see all the revenue. So collectively, this represents over 5,000 websites. When we look at the revenue differences, when you get rid of cookies, prices fall by 28%. When you get rid of cookies and have privacy sandbox, then prices fall by 25%. And so the recovery share is only 11% there. And that's a little bit of an oversimplification because the ad latency, as I mentioned briefly before, is about twice as high in the 75th percentile for status quo and cookieless. And actually that problem is so bad that sometimes the latency is such that the user, leaves before the impression loads. And when you account for that, we estimate that there's about 3.1% fewer impressions in the privacy sandbox group. And because that means you get no revenue, our very meager 11% number was actually too high. When you redo the calculation, we see the revised recovery share is about 2.8%. So, maybe the award or penalty for speed running here is if we want to reduce this to a meme, if you're a publisher, you're worried about browsers getting rid of third-party cookies, you might hope that Privacy Sandbox is rescuing you a little bit, and it is to some limited extent, but the fact that there's fewer impressions are rendering is going to take you a little further away from your goal. But again, on the publisher side, if nobody uses these technologies, you're not going to have an effect here. And so part of this, small recovery share is a function of limited industry adoption. So I guess we're at time. So thank you everyone for your questions and comments and your attention today. And thanks again to the organizers.